Можеме ли да почнеме, драги гости? Ке го отворам ова прва сесија на проектот Критичко преиспитување на правото во 2019 година, во оваа година. Проектот влегува во втора година. На општо задоволство чинам. Имавме неколку мощни, добри предавања на респектибилни гости на темите на проектот Психоанализа и право, мултикултурализам и право, авторитаризам и право и биополитика и право. Тимот на проектот, јас, Ирена Речиновска и Вики Младенова ве поздравува и денеска, и вечерва, и на ова денешно предавање на кое чест ни прави професор Аленка Zupančič, словенска авторка, славна словенска авторка, морам да кажам, една од членовите на така наречената словенечка психоаналитичка школа. Професор Аленка е авторка која работи како истражувач во рамките на Филозофскиот институт, истражувачкиот центар во рамки на Словенечката академија на науките и уметностите, а редовно предава и на European Graduate School. Автор е на бројни научни текстови, книги во областа на психоанализата и филозофијата. Меѓу нив, тоа оглавно сите сме го читале, ако бидам оптимиста, Ethics of the Real, The Shortest Shadow, Psychology of the Two, Why Psychoanalysis и најновата книга What is Sex. Денес, всушност вечер, ќе ни представи настап под наслов Сакај го соседот како што се сакаш себе си. Кратко, пред да идам збор на ценетата професорка, збор 2 зошто психоанализа и право. Психоаналитичката юриспруденција не е посебно популарна во правото и тоа со причина. Психоанализата и незината метода на анализа функционира како расцеп, како траума за еден од основните драйва на правото, да биде омнипотентно, да биде во себе непротивречно, да биде кохерентно, да биде мастер означувач кој има амбиција да го замени, односно да стапи на местото на паднатиот бог. Психоанализата го соочува правото со нова рационалност под наводници на неговите граници, на поделеноста која носи однатре, на јавна и обсцена страна и посебно на насилството со кое е создадено и кое постојано го носи или го потиснува во себе правото, било како насилство кое создава право или насилство кое го одржува правото. Подоцна. Посебно го соочува со неговата условеност од joyousness, од уживањето кое од една страна, според Лакан, спротивно на символното во семинарот 7 или од друга страна е уживањето на символното во семинарот 17. Независно, психоанализата е неугодноста всушност во правото, стартувајќи со интерпретација на неговите симптоми, таа го дестабилизира, го дезинтегрира, ги дезинтегрира неговите кохерентни наративи и го деинтерпретира на некој начин правото. Го посочува на така наречениот скандал на правото. И во таа смисла, јас сметам дека една од најплодните и најпродуктивни лостови за критичко преиспитување на правото, што е наша всушност тема. И зошто сега и како во ова се вклопува се темата Сакај го соседот како самиот себе. Тој вредносен императив, таа реченица, тој исказ, е еден од основните оски околу кои се организира неугодното во културата, според Фройд. Комплексноста на тој однос со другиот е субстанцијална за субјективизирање на субјектот, а се конституира преку желбата на субјектот, desire of the subject. Незината ултимативна сатисфакција е единствено преку желбата на другиот. Тоа брилјантно го има објаснето еден колега на Аленка Младен Долар. И таа desire is desire of the other, и таа интеракција на две празнини двете желби на двата субјекта посакуваат исто нешто. Признавање и задоволување во тоа признавање од другиот. Взаемно се исклучуваат и може да се впуштат во борба до смрт. Од една страна, желбата на субјектот стреми кон афирмација преку намалување на автономијата на другиот и на неговите желби, тој е тој друг соседот, радикално другиот, мигрантот whatever. А од друга страна стреми кон признавање од другиот, да добие признавање на собствената позиција. Во оваа динамика се случува таа интеракција со радикалниот друг и неговите желби, и неговото уживање всушност, кое може да отиде од уништување и расизам во прифаќање и признавање. И таа интеракција е комплицирана, е амбивалентна, посебно е отколку, да речеме, отколку што предпоставува релација со другиот во наративот на Левинас. Лакановската е покомплицирана и посложена и мислам дека е на некој начин по-илуминативна за тој однос. Сега за тоа и околу тоа со нескриена возбуда ја очекуваме презентацијата на професорката Аленка Zupančič. И Alenka, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for this introduction, which I kind of understood. I can understand Croatian, Serbian, even some Macedonian, but I cannot speak or deliver a lecture in these languages, so I will, I'm sorry, speak English. Hopefully, if there are any things that are not clear on the level of on the linguistic level, you can just perhaps stop me and I can repeat or whatever. So thank you for giving me this opportunity, Ljubomir, to be here today in this wonderful setting. I really appreciate the invitation and all of you coming here today. I hope I will not kind of bore you too much with my lecture, which I think will go on for approximately 1 hour, in which I will take up this question of law and psychoanalysis from a very singular perspective, which refers not so much to the law in general, but to what we refer to as the Christian law contained in the Commandments. And as announced in the title, I will particularly look at this commandment, love your neighbor as you love yourself, and also look at its destiny in the contemporary, particularly conservative politics, which on the one hand very much want to acclaim the Christian tradition, the Christian heritage, but at the same time has problems with this commandment precisely. And we will see how and what is all kind of acrobatics, argumentative acrobatics that comes from it. So in the first part, I will just briefly, like for perhaps 15 minutes, introduce some psychoanalytic approach or to this question of the neighbor. And then we will move to these more political waters and try to analyze also with this apparatus what is going on there. So I know that this must be a kind of a mixed crowd, so I suppose for some of you these psychoanalytic notions are well known, for some less well known, so I will try to briefly explain some things, but don't worry too much. I mean, for the central, this kind of political argument, it's not even so essential that you kind of understand everything from the first part. So it's just, I will start with a quote from Freud, which was written in 1930, but I think we could easily find it today and we would think that this was written today, because I think the climate, the social climate that we live in today has not changed a lot. And the quote goes like this. Their neighbor is for the people not only a potential helper or sexual object, but also someone who tempts them to satisfy their aggressiveness on him, to exploit his capacity for work without compensation, to use him sexually without his consent, to seize his possessions, to humiliate him, to cause him pain, to torture, and to kill him. So these are kind of a very gloomy lines about what is the neighbor relations consist of in kind of a nutshell. So Freud wrote this in 1930. And this is part of his essay, the civilization and its discontent. And it's part of his discussion precisely of the love your neighbor as yourself commandment. So Freud was kind of horrified by this commandment, and then Lacan kind of examines why is this so and what caused this kind of malaise also in Freud. So Freud actually found this commandment together with another one, love thy enemies as thyself, or just love thy enemies, as the same thing. So, and for him it was kind of incomprehensible, how should we do this? Why should we love our neighbor, a perfect stranger? But above all, how on earth are we to achieve this if we take the word love seriously, not just in some kind of a very vague way, but if love is meant in the strong sense of the term, how could we simply love somebody that we just met or we don't know, or looks very strange and so on. So this is just, this is Freud, and we'll briefly return to this. I won't go into this in extenso, it's a long debate. I would rather prefer to start with a very brief sketch of what I really think it's Lacan's Jacques Lacan's extremely important contribution or intervention into this whole debate of the question of the neighbor, which of course is not only part of psychoanalytic debate, also philosophical debate. Ljubomir mentioned Levinas, who also has written a lot on this question of the neighbor and so on. I think that Lacan's intervention is very powerful because it actually equips us with tools with which to think not only the problems of the neighbor, but to kind of, he actually forges a kind of a concept of this term, the neighbor. What is the neighbor? The concept which precisely explains or aims at explaining what seems like this inevitable aggressivity, hostility that springs up every time we come too close to this neighbor. This hostility that is also part of what Freud, of this quote from Freud that I just read to you. So what Lacan proposes is a way to how to explain this. And of course, the neighbor does not simply refer to the person next door or someone close to us. This can be any kind of stranger, like precisely this is the sense of the biblical term. And Lacan has linked this concept to a very specific structure, which he called, and this is a word that doesn't exist in French, he coined it extimité. Extremity is the English translation. It's kind of excluded interior or included exterior, or something precisely that cuts across the divide between outside and inside that we kind of tend to form in order to feel good in our own position or to distinguish ourselves from the other and so on. So it's something at the same time most intimate to me, but at the same time most external and foreign, even unrecognizable. It belongs to me, but at the same time it can function as completely disgusting or foreign. And just to cut the long story short, I will give you a very good example, I think, of this structure provided also by a friend of mine, Slavoj Žižek. Take this example, you have a clear, clean glass, and say you spit in it. And it would be very difficult for you then for anybody to make you drink this back, just to swallow back what just a moment ago was part of you. So there is this kind of an interesting move that happens here, that something that just a moment ago was an integral part of you, something intimately yours, something clean in this sense, in this move, in this passage becomes an object of ultimate disgust. It's no longer, it's this foreign object that you don't want to have anything to do with. So this is very, in a nutshell, what the structure of extremity aims at explaining, precisely this kind of configuration, this kind of topology. And so according to Lacan, this structure is actually at work in our interactions with others, with the other, if you want, which is never simply a relationship of a kind of symmetrical mirroring or of partnership and respect. There is always a much more complicated dialectics involved in this relationship to others, to the other. Kind of asymmetry, overlapping, partial overlapping, as well as this kind of irreducible dimension of an object. It's never simply the subject that one sees. It's also an object in him or her that is kind of disturbing or blurring this image. But if this structure is always there, let's say, it's not always visible, it doesn't always come to the front. And the injunction to love, precisely, or perhaps even simply love, is something that involves going beyond precisely a certain limit in this kind of imaginary limit that at the same time separates me from the other and relates me to her as my semblable, like it's a good French word, like my fellow man who resembles me, my podobnik. I don't know if this term exists in Macedonian. So somebody who is my fellow man who fundamentally resembles me, but then there is something more that comes into play with this demand of love. Some limit is crossed here, certain the imaginary territory is crossed. Okay, so in the seminar on ethics of psychoanalysis, Lacan comments on this commandment to love your neighbor as yourself, and he also discusses Freud's passionate reaction to it. And he attributes his aversion, kind of a resistance to it, to his belonging. This is Freud's belonging to the horizon of the Aristotelian ethics and Aristotelian conception of good, of the good. And for Lacan, Freud still to some extent belongs to this tradition because of the way in which he formulated his famous pleasure principle. As you probably know, this is one of the pleasure principle for Freud is the principle which regulates basically all our mental events. Reality principle is its prolongation that also kind of takes into account certain obstacles and so on. But basically, a pleasure principle, it's not at all a kind of hedonist principle it's not about our actively striving for pleasure, want to experience pleasurable things, but it is basically about regulation or diminution of unpleasure, which Freud relates with tension. So whenever there is a kind of surplus excitement, excitation, surplus tension, pleasure principle is there to kind of try to reimpose some kind of homeostasis. It's kind of a good, right measure of things. And precisely because of this, here, Lacan recognizes the Aristotelian ethics, which, as you probably know, very much revolves precisely around this idea of the right measure, of the way in which we should avoid all extremes, excesses, and so on. And this is precisely why also in Aristotle we find this relationship between pleasure and good. Not, again, as a kind of hedonistic principle, but pleasure in the sense of moderacy is good. And what Lacan wants to point out is that this conception of good comes with a certain price. It comes with a price of omitting or forgetting or repressing even an entire field of our functioning, which escapes this kind of regulation, this kind of avoidance of tension and so on, and follows its own very different logic. And actually Freud himself already saw this quite clearly, namely that pleasure principle very often fails to conduct its supposedly universal role, and that people are, even more often than not, can be driven by things that are not reducible to or explainable by the pleasure principle. For instance, people tend to repeat certain traumatic experiences. There is something which is going on precisely beyond the pleasure principle, as goes one of the title of Freud's essays. This is precisely what brought Freud to write this article Beyond the Pleasure Principle, when he was confronted in his work, in analysis, but also like in everyday experience with lots of examples precisely of behavior when people behaved against, so to say, their pleasure principle or interest or something like this. And Freud, at least, this is a little bit more complicated, but in principle he linked this other behavior, this beyond the pleasure principle, to what he called this destructive death drive as the opposite of the pleasure principle. But this opposition, I'm now going very quickly and to kind of wrap this up, this opposition between pleasure principle and this other whatever death drive, a simple opposition was already by Freud seen as something difficult to sustain at some examples, and Lacan actually flatly rejected it. And to put it simply, it seems that if confronted with this situation that I just described, that we have like two possibilities. We can postulate, as Freud did at some point, the existence of two competing principles, like eros and thanatos, or life drives, pleasure principle and death drives, as coexisting in human beings. This would be one possibility. Or else, instead of saying that the pleasure principle does not exhaust the economic side of our mental life, and hence introduce yet another second principle, we can conclude that pleasure principle in itself is not as straight, as unproblematic, as unambiguous as it seems to be. So that there is a problem with this principle itself, not that we need another one to kind of explain these exceptions. And this is basically Lacan's move or his conclusion, namely that this beyond against which the pleasure principle is supposed to protect us and keep us away from, like safely away, actually constitutes like its own impossible core, its own impossible excluded center or kernel. So that the whole economy of the pleasure principle is based upon an impossible excluded thing, this famous das Ding that he talks about in the ethics seminar, at its very heart. And this economy or regulation is precisely what is also at stake in the Aristotelian notion of the right measure, of this moderateness and so on. And precisely in its link to the notion of the good. Okay, so, and it is precisely at this excluded, impossible, extimate place of the pleasure principle itself that Lacan places what he calls jouissance, this enjoyment in this specific sense in which he conceives this. Again, not at all enjoyment as yet another hedonism, striving for pleasure or debauchery and so on. Enjoyment is precisely different from pleasure in the sense that it does not stop at the limit of pleasure. It is a kind of return of the impossible thing in the middle of our everyday life. But above all, as I said, it doesn't simply refer to debauchery or hedonism, but rather functions in Lacan as the name or the concept of this kind of structural effect produced by going beyond or traversing a certain limit. A certain limit in pleasure, a certain limit in our relationship to the other. It is not there is no particular content of this pleasure or enjoyment. It is the effect of crossing a certain limit that produces this effect, that is no longer just pleasure, this is enjoyment. Okay, so in this sense, we could say that aggression does not have its roots in another separate principle, separate from the pleasure principle, but constitutes more like its other side, its inherent contradiction. It is like indicator or symptom of its own limit, of its own cost. And so precisely in this perspective, the pleasure principle is not so much a primary, original principle of functioning of our psychical apparatus, as is already a defense formation, we could say, built around a negativity, this impossibility at its very core. Okay, and now we come back to this love thy neighbor command, because actually Lacan insists on how Freud, in his reading of Love Your Neighbor, emphasized precisely the term love. It seems that in the commandment at stake, it is precisely love that breaks defense or breaks defense of the pleasure principle, defense or this kind of wall separating us from this beyond which appears as evil. But what is this evil? As we have seen, Lacan situates here enjoyment, jouissance, as the structural effect precisely of this very breaking down of the defense, of the wall. So the pleasure principle, and with it its traditional Aristotelian notion of the good, kind of indicate, even create, a certain beyond against which they protect us, like keeping us on the safe side of this divide. So, and it is here that the question of the neighbor also comes in the relationship to the good. In the injunction to love your neighbor, the neighbor kind of gives body to this beyond. And this precisely triggers the question of evil, which sort of inevitably dwells, lodges in this neighbor. But, and this is kind of Lacan's coup de force, if this is the case, if it always lodges in our neighbor, then it also always lodges, dwells within me. And this is a short quote from Lacan: what is more of a neighbor to me than this heart within which is that of my jouissance, and which I don't dare go near? For as soon as I go near it, there rises up the unfathomable aggressivity from which I flee. So this is, I mean, some of you know this, but this is for Lacan's key point, that jouissance, enjoyment, is precisely not something that we kind of recognize as ours. It's not something that we want. It's usually precisely something that we don't recognize as our enjoyment. So this is why, again, there is this extremity relation. Okay, so I will just one more point and I will conclude this introduction. We could put it like this: it is structurally or necessarily unclear whether this excluded kernel of my being is in fact mine or my neighbor's. What is? Another formulation of this is also, you could say, to enjoy is to trespass. There is always this kind of, the moment enjoyment can, there is always some other which is already involved there, and vice versa. If the other enjoys, I seem to be somehow involved in it. So it implies by definition the topology of extimacy. And this is precisely the fundamental structure and difficulty that psychoanalysis has to confront, has to think this structure and handle it in a better way, according to Lacan, in a more efficient way than simply by reinforcing and taking shelter behind this wall of the pleasure principle, which is constituted on the repression of this other dimension. Okay, so this is just, I will conclude this part, and just perhaps to, if this enjoyment sounds a bit strange relating to the other and this hatred, but just think of how very often racism is expressed precisely as the way in which the other enjoys. There is, for instance, very often, I mean, if you have a neighbor from a different ethnic group and they cook things from their whatever parts of the world, and this smell which is coming from their apartment disturbs you terribly. It's not simply objectively the smell which is the problematic, but precisely because this smell kind of is a vehicle of how they enjoy, and they enjoy differently than you do. It's kind of, so all this, there is always, whenever there is this kind of aggressivity, the question of a specific mode of enjoyment precisely is always at stake. In this, do they enjoy more than us? Do they enjoy on our expense? What is going on here? And this is precisely what I will now try to go into through this jump from psychoanalysis to a very different source, which is the way precisely in which the commandment to love your neighbor is commented in contemporary Western conservative politics, from moderate conservative to extreme right wing. As I already briefly mentioned, this commandment obviously confronts this politics with a considerable problem. Because on the one hand, this politics has to endorse it, since a crucial element of its position is kind of ideological legitimation and rhetoric. In this rhetoric, you have the constant reference to Christianity as the core of our Western identity. This is, as you know, kind of constant adagio. So they have to endorse this. But on the other hand, particularly this commandment is seen as possibly ceding too much to the neighbor as our other, and hence as a serious threat to our identity. And this, of course, became particularly palpable and explicit with the 2015 refugee crisis. And I will now give you a very nice example and eloquent, I think, of this problem and of this acrobatics that I mentioned. Namely, when in October 2015, Tony Abbott, the Prime Minister of Australia at that time, was invited to London to deliver what they call the Margaret Thatcher Lecture. This Margaret Thatcher Society organizes annual lectures to which they invite respectful politicians, conservative politicians. So he was giving this lecture in London in 2015, and among other things, he said the following, I now quote Abbott. He said, "The safety and prosperity that exists almost uniquely in Western countries is an irresistible magnet. These blessings are not the accidents of history, but product of values painstakingly discerned and refined, and of practices carefully cultivated and reinforced over hundreds of years. Implicitly or explicitly, the imperative to love your neighbor as you love yourself is at the heart of every Western polity. It expresses itself in laws protecting workers, in strong social security safety nets, and in the readiness to take in refugees. It is what makes us decent and humane countries as well as prosperous ones, but, you know, you were expecting this but probably, but right now, this wholesome instinct is leading much of Europe into catastrophic error. No country or continent can open its borders to all comers without fundamentally weakening itself. This is the risk that the countries of Europe now run through misguided altruism." End of quote. Okay, so perhaps before we try to follow the meanders of this argument and of how this commandment is dealt with in this argument, it's perhaps fair to mention that Tony Abbott's speech was actually met in Australia, in Australian media, with, as one defender of Abbott put it, a unanimous chorus of jeers and condemnation. So the reaction was quite interesting. Christian commentators pointed out that Jesus' command to love our neighbor is the heart of Christian morality, and we can't simply set it aside when it happens to be costly or inconvenient. And actually, Catholic priests stated that they were absolutely astounded and appalled by Abbott's remarks. And on social media, the following post on Facebook allegedly summed up the general feeling. So somebody wrote, "He, that is Abbott, is so going to hell." Which is, I don't know, I find this kind of interesting, particularly since, of course, in Christian Europe, this sentiment did not prevail at all. And particularly the self-proclaimed Christian politicians rather took recourse to, as we know, closing the borders, building walls or barbed wire fences, and to implementing a severe, we could call it, screw your neighbor legislation, is basically what happened. But what exactly did Abbott preach in London, if we now look a little bit into his argument? He did not reject the Christian commandment to love your neighbor, which he recognized at the very heart of every Western polity, but preached a moderate, reasonable, modest usage of this commandment. Of course, you should love your neighbor, but reasonably, not too much, not too many, not beyond a certain limit. We could say that he preached for the properly Christian ethics to cede its place to the Aristotelian ethics of the right measure, to some extent. Or perhaps to put it in another, even more succinct formula, perhaps, he kind of called for love to be substituted by altruism. That is, by the correct, not misguided altruism. And I think we can see this move clearly if we jump back to Freud for just a moment. As you know, Freud was not religious, but he saw, of course, that to love your neighbor beyond reciprocity and beyond the limit of convenience and of a pleasurable exchange was the whole point of this Christian commandment. And this whole point is precisely what Abbott now designates as misguided altruism, which, by the way, I think it's a very interesting definition of love. You know, love is a misguided altruism that goes too far or kind of turns a screw. So, and I think that even if perhaps not visible at the first sight, this move from love to altruism is actually something that rhymes profoundly with, I make a jump here, but with capitalist or market economy and ideology. The emphasis on philanthropy and humanitarian projects is itself not anecdotal, I think, in capitalist discourse, but here I'm referring to more specifically to the logic that governs the field of goods and commodities and their association with good in the moral sense of the term. So I will bring in here a little bit of economics and of liberal politics, which of course Tony Abbott is very much part of, and I think it's part of this argument as well. So as far as this question of the good goes, and precisely its compatibility with altruism, some of you know probably that Jeremy Bentham formulated his famous principle of utility as promoting the greatest good for the greatest, largest number. And he proposed this as a moral principle, and this principle was and still is often criticized as something that inevitably comes up against the demands of my egoism. That is to say, psychological egoism rules out acting to promote the overall good or well-being when the latter is incompatible with our own good. This is a kind of objection to Bentham. But Lacan, on the other hand, and I think much more interestingly, pointed out that this objection to Bentham was misplaced and insufficient. He says, and this is a quote from the Ethics of Psychoanalysis, "My egoism is quite content with a certain altruism. Altruism of the kind that is situated on the level of the useful. It is a fact of experience that what I want is the good of others in the image of my own. That doesn't cost much. What I want is the good of others, provided that it remain in the image of my own." And here, I think this is a very important point that you can also recognize very often when it comes even to some kind of Western countries trying to impose or save whatever other countries from their own difficulties. You always have this construction of a good other who is like us, who behaves more or less democratically or respects women and so on, and then this other who is everything else, and precisely whose good is not in the image of our own, and the dividing part is there. It's not the other itself is then split between these two figures. Okay, so but the point here that I wanted to kind of bring your attention to is that altruism and egoism kind of combine without a problem. This is not a major problem. We like to be good. We like to kind of, this is not so. So far as we are in the realm of goods, precisely, and their sharing. The limit of my good is not simply the good of the other or others. Lacan even says it is in the nature of the good to be altruistic. But this is not the love of thy neighbor. So here we come back to the difference between precisely altruism as finally fully compatible with the fields of goods, and love as something else, as situated precisely beyond a certain limit of the calculus of good, of pleasure, and of reciprocity. And I will now read you a very colorful explication by Lacan, how he explains this difference. So if we were in the United States, I should have said trigger warning, some difficult language, but actually I really find this quite remarkable, the way Lacan puts it here. He says, as long as it's a question of the good, there is no problem. Our own and our neighbors are of the same material. Saint Martin shares his cloak. This refers to a biblical story in which Saint Martin shares his cloak with a naked beggar who begs him for the clothes. So Saint Martin shares his cloak, and a great deal is made of it. Yet it is after all a simple question of training. Material is by its very nature made to be disposed of. It belongs to the other as much as it belongs to me. We are no doubt touching a primitive requirement in the need to be satisfied here, for the beggar is naked. But perhaps over and above the need to be clothed, he was begging for something else, namely that Saint Martin either kill him or fuck him. In any encounter, there is a big difference in meaning between the response of philanthropy and that of love. End of quote. Okay, so you see, first of all, perhaps something that we should be careful not to jump to a conclusion too quickly. When Lacan says kill him or fuck him, I think we should not take these two examples as a kind of designating an objective limit. On the one side, on the one side, kind of pre-established things that can be shared or exchanged, and on the other side, the list of things that cannot be shared. After all, we've heard in some Eskim countries, they also offer you whatever to sleep with your device. What I want to say is that this difference, this dividing line certainly and structurally always exists, but things do pass from one side to another, following all kinds of conditions in concrete historical, cultural, economic, social circumstances. So it's not simply that in itself something cannot be, it's always a limit that determines what is beyond it and what cannot be done or shared and so on. So I think when Lacan says, imagine that he, the beggar, would ask you to kill him or fuck him, he's doing two things at the same time. He chooses a received and striking example of the difference or limit between the pleasure principle and its possible beyond, something that goes beyond this kind of reciprocity and the sharing of the goods, possibly love. And he points out that this limit, whenever and wherever it happens to appear, is precisely the point where or beyond which the structure of fantasy, our fantasy, kicks in. And here I refer to the fantasy in this Lacanian sense of the word, which is not simply dreaming about things, but the way in which Lacan defines fantasy is as a kind of fundamental screen through which we look to the reality so as for it to make sense. So it's not so fantasy is a certain kind of a rationalization of some things that help us to sustain or support certain things in the reality that otherwise could be disturbing for us. And so just to give you an example of what I mean, that whenever this limit is crossed, the plague of fantasy starts. For instance, although it can be factually true that, I don't know, Muslim culture and has a different idea of manhood and womanhood as our Christian culture, when we start imagining what this Muslim man would do to our women, this is no longer about any factual difference. It is precisely the structure of fantasy, and this is of our fantasy, is already fully operative. Which is to say that it is precisely our own jouissance that we attempt to control, regulate, keep at bay with this kind of fantasies. It's always there, again, difficult to say when I end and the other begins. Okay, so to go back to a previous point, like capitalist discourse, in spite of its accent that it puts on individualism and egoism, is not in any fundamental contradiction with a certain kind of altruism, with what Lacan also calls humanitariety. Namely, for what is good? Good is something that can be divided, distributed, exchanged. And our society, or rather our economy, brought this to its peak. Good is everything that subscribes in principle to a universal equivalent. I think this is a kind of a definition of the structure of good and of the goods. And I'm not trying to indulge in some kind of a cheap criticism of our whatever consumerist society. I really mean this in as a kind of a logical definition of the good as it exists today. It is in the nature of good to subscribe to a general equivalent. Otherwise, it is not a good. But love, that's a wholly different matter. Which is why, kind of first consequence, love is not exactly a good. And I think we can indeed see a kind of, particularly lately, a kind of ideological depreciation of love growing fast in our societies. Love is kind of more and more fishy. What comes to replace it is kind of whatever consent for partnership, like this kind of ideal symmetrical, where there is nothing else but this kind of mirroring of, or mutual exchange of satisfaction, whatever. But precisely, love is more and more seen as something problematic. Okay, now I will return to Tony Abbott's speech. We could say that I think he is quite right when he says that the commandment to love your neighbor expresses itself in laws protecting workers, in strong social security safety nets, and in the readiness to take in refugees. What is bizarre about his claim is that what he is describing here, of course, is usually associated with the politics of the left, and very much criticized as such by the conservative right to which he belongs. He at the moment when he made this speech, he was at the head of the Liberal Party of Australia, which is this kind of centre-right conservative Liberal Party. Moreover, and now I think it's the cherry on the cake comes in, the fact that this quote is from his Margaret Thatcher lecture cannot strike us as doubly perverse. As a matter of fact, Thatcher turns out to be a very good lead when it comes to researching the destiny of the neighbor in conservative liberal politics. Namely, in this famous interview from 1987, in which she launched the equally famous and famous thesis that there is no such thing as society, and which was a very frontal attack precisely on laws protecting workers, and particularly on strong social security safety nets. The word neighbor appears twice in her speech. So now I will give you a quote from this famous interview, which, as I said, was really, it is at that very moment that the whole dismantling of the welfare state began. Not only in England, but then more globally. But this is precisely the moment when all these security networks that Abbott mentions that are so much built into the Western policy start disintegrating. Okay, so you will see like two symptomatic points when the term neighbor appears in this quote. Okay, this is Thatcher. People are casting their problems on society, and who is society? There is no such thing. There are individual men and women, and there are families, and no government can do anything except through people, and people look to themselves first. It is our duty to look after ourselves and then also to help look after our neighbor. And life is a reciprocal business, and people have got the entitlements too much in mind without the obligations, because there is no such thing as an entitlement unless someone has first met an obligation. And it is, I think, one of the tragedies in which many of the benefits we give, which were meant to reassure people that they were sick, that if they were sick or ill, there was a safety net and there was help. That was the objective. But somehow there are some people who have been manipulating the system, and so some of those help and benefits that were meant to say to people, all right, if you cannot get a job, you shall have a basic standard of living. But when people come and say, but what is the point of working? I can get as much on the dole, that is on unemployment aid. You say, look, this is not from the dole, it is your neighbor who is supplying it. Okay. So, as you can see, the neighbor appears twice. First, she appears in a strangely shameless reversal of the biblical commandment, considering that the lines come nevertheless from a devoted Christian, as Thatcher is supposed to be, when she says it is our duty to look after ourselves and then also to help look after our neighbor. For me, this recalls, this instruction that you get at the airplanes. If the oxygen masks appear first, put it onto you and then help the others. So perhaps in the case of oxygen, this functions better, but here you have this reversal. Okay. And the fact that this biblical commandment presents her with a serious and confusing problem was openly admitted by Thatcher on another occasion already, when she said, and this is actually 1 year later, very brief quote, this is a speech that she gave in Scotland. She said, I confess that I always had difficulty with interpreting the biblical precept to love our neighbors as ourselves, until I read some of the words of C.C. Lewis. He pointed out that we don't exactly love ourselves when we fall below standards and beliefs that we have accepted. Indeed, we might even hate ourselves for some unworthy deed. Okay, this, as you can see, it's a very interesting approach at interpreting the commandment at step. According to this interpretation, the commandment does not imply that we should always love our neighbors or love them unconditionally, but through a rather kind of banal maneuver of psychologization, the words as ourselves are used to simply relativize the commandment, to supply a justification for not obeying it. We don't always love ourselves, and hence we don't always need to love our neighbor. Okay, we could go into debate, which would be much more interesting, why do we not always love ourselves and so on, but obviously this is not the point that she wants to kind of come to. It is simply that we don't always love ourselves, so we don't need to love our neighbor always. And hence the Thatcher-Abbott axiom is born. Of course we should love our neighbor, but there is a limit. And I think here perhaps you can fully appreciate the difference between Freud's honesty and this kind of manipulative opportunism of the Thatcher-Abbott position. Freud doesn't say that the commandment at stake is basically good, but sometimes too demanding and excessive, and that in these cases we can simply ignore it. No, Freud claims that it is basically horrifying. He immediately says that it demands from us precisely traversing of a certain limit. And this is precisely why it's for him an important source of what he calls discontent in civilization, because it's impossible to meet this demand. And also Lacan's kind of a critical point concerning Freud here is also an acknowledgement of Freud's honesty, precisely. Freud saw very well that there was what was at stake in loving your neighbor aims beyond the neighbor simply as this kind of symmetrical fellow man, and involves our confronting precisely what strikes us as most foreign, as most difficult to swallow, precisely, heterogeneous. And we could say that, if anything, this is the radical stake involved in Christian legacy, whereas the Thatcher-Abbott position, on the other hand, is essentially opportunistic. It has no trouble subordinating the Christian legacy, which it needs for its legitimation, to its own very profane or everyday political ideological agenda. Okay, so then Neighbour reappears at the end of this Thatcher quote, this time as an abused neighbor. If you are on the dole, if you are receiving unemployment aid, you are effectively stealing from your neighbor. So there is no dole, it's the neighbor who is behind it. Or put the other way around, people on the dole are bad neighbors, parasitic neighbors living on your account. Like society, the dole does not really exist. It is a term or ideology that, according to Thatcher, mispresents the actual relation between real people. And I think that Thatcher's attack on the welfare state was also, and perhaps primarily, an attack on something else, namely and precisely on love and solidarity among neighbors as a social form, and as such also based on symbolic mediation. Welfare state is a kind of institutional solidarity. It is, among other things, depersonalized love for one's neighbor. Yeah, it is a kind of delegated love with many social advantages that come with this delegation. Of course, you can ask, can love be impersonal? Yes, I mean, at the level of the society, it can only be such, but it is not simply the question of the difference between individual and social and society. I cannot go into this, but from what Lacan develops on the question of the neighbor in the ethics seminar, it actually follows that even at its most personal, individual, the love of your neighbor, when this dimension emerges, precisely involves a kind of depersonalized, or as he calls it, unhuman dimension, or that love for your neighbor is actually always involves a relationship with an inhuman partner. Okay, I won't go into there are many things here, but just to point out that there is something, if you really want to follow this logic, that it's not simply about personal as opposed to social, but there is a kind of a impersonal, in a good sense, core in the very at the very heart of precisely this kind of more passionate, also personal love. Okay, we could also put it like this. The dole is there precisely so that I, as a person, don't need to love my neighbor. The accent is on, in this negation, of course, is on I, not on love. It is a kind of delegation of this love to a social infrastructure. It is the existence of this love in the form of social infrastructure. Welfare state loves your neighbor for you. And if I insist on the term love in this context, it is because in many respects welfare state stretches, I think, beyond simple reciprocity. It exists as something that transcends altruism as the mirroring precisely of my own good in the image of my neighbor's good. It's not this kind of directly translatable. And I cannot feel good also. It's not this, it doesn't precisely give you this kind of reward. I feel good because I just helped this poor beggar. In this sense, the dole, the unemployment aid, is not so much a safety net as we could say also an interface. And Thatcher's kind of nominalist maneuver was precisely out to repersonalize the dole, to repersonalize it just enough for the people to see or to recognize a neighbor in it, a neighbor, their neighbor. A neighbor shamelessly enjoying on their account precisely. The whole strategy looks a little bit like we could say, let's put a face on the dole. How does the dole with a human face look like? Well, it looks like an evil neighbor. But of course, this is only one part of the neoliberal story. This is what people who have jobs and are not on the dole or any other social benefits should feel. So that this is all very personal. On the other side, on the side of the receivers, it is a very different story. No question of getting personal there. On the contrary, this kind of purely and extremely non-personal bureaucratic net makes sure that you don't get to talk meaningfully to any person. I don't know if you have seen Ken Loach's movie, I, Daniel Blake. I really recommend it. It's a brilliant rendering precisely of this. If you need the dole, this unemployment aid, you are presented with an impenetrable bureaucratic procedures, like completely incomprehensible gibber deprived of all human feeling and common sense. All there, of course, to prevent abuse. That is to protect those who work from you who have lost your work and need help. In other words, there is a safety net here, all right, but now it's protecting those who don't particularly need protection. It doesn't protect those who remain outside, but those who are on the inside. And I think this particular kind of wall, which is very easily penetratable, even transparent, as if non-existent from one side, and at the same time utterly impenetrable and non-transparent from the other side, is one of the most salient topological figures, I think, of our times and of the functioning of late capitalism. Because I think that also this discussion of the status of the neighbor needs to be put precisely in its historical and economic context today. And the specificity of this context should be taken into the account. For example, within, I would put it like this, and I think Lacan really helps us to see this, within the capitalist economy and its particular form of value, proximity is not the opposite of alienation, but rather its form. In our social economic order, the place of maximum proximity is not our neighborhood, but it is the market. It is the global market. It is there that our most intimate and precious possession, precisely our labor force as value, our value as embodied in the products of our labor, it is there that this precious possession mingles shamelessly with other people's intimate possessions and values, compares to them, competes with them, gets exchanged for them. So it is not the kind of immediate bodily proximity, it is the proximity of our value, even of our surplus value, and its exchangeability, of course. And this is precisely why I think, because market now has this structural place, why Lacan was able to predict already back in 1967, he said our future as common markets will be balanced by an increasingly hardline extension of the process of segregation. Why? This was really kind of something to say in '67, kind of a very prophetic thing to say. Why is this so? Why global markets will be accompanied by segregation? Because market is precisely this place of compulsory structural proximity, sameness, and it has often been pointed out that whereas globalization is all about the mobility of the capital, it is much less about the mobility of the people. But I think one should complicate this a little bit more and say that the opposition is not simply that between capital on the one hand and people on the other, but rather between people and something in people more than people, as Lacan would say, that precisely this precious treasure that we have, our value, our use, our value as a labor force, something in us more than us, which is actually situated on the other side, outside ourselves, on the side of the capital, its accumulation and global circulation. And hence, of course, also subjected to its radical abstraction. So I say, and I will skip one part and I will very briefly conclude now. I think that the growing sense among people that they are worth nothing or very little is directly dependent on the capitalist ontology in which being is value. We are reduced to nothing but value. And this is a very doubtful privilege, as already Marx knew very well. And Lacan actually makes the same point in another seminar, the other side of psychoanalysis. He says that as workers, we have been reduced to nothing but value, which may sound paradoxical. Is value and being of value not something good and positive? This is precisely in the obviousness of this, both Marx and Lacan kind of sharply intervene. When our being becomes value, we are in for some nasty surprises. And if we feel worthless, the answer does not lie in the attempt and the competing for higher valorization, but rather in an attempt to get out precisely of this capitalist form of value. Okay, I won't go into this, I skipped one part and this wouldn't make much sense. I will briefly conclude by making one point that I already made, kind of, namely that I think among many other things, psychoanalysis can help us understand here, also in speaking of this commandment and of the social economy that we are living in, it can help us understand a very important structural topological feature of the global market. Namely that it is precisely the global market that has become the universal point of our extimacy, of this thing that I explained at the beginning. This, glass into which you spit and then you can no longer swallow your own saliva. Global market is not simply inside or outside. We are part of it, of course. We work, we sweat and spit into its pot, and what we get back looks like sordid and impossible to swallow very often. Yet it is us, it is our most intimate being, our value, which makes it all the more unbearable. And I think we could say that neighbors, like foreigners or immigrants, often appear today precisely as the agents of this extimate point of global market, as the human face of this faceless global capitalist economy. And actually, this is a point made also by some others, how very often even the refugees are perceived as a kind of agents of the global capital. Like they are kind of dismantling the nation states and so on. They bring this kind of globalization with multiple languages and so on. Okay, so I would simply conclude by saying that these intensely discussed cultural differences, for instance, function more and more as a kind of handy and colorful veil that masks a much more disturbing sameness. A veil that makes, I think, it possible for us not to see and to keep at distance something the reality of which is nevertheless kind of closing in on us. Namely that this worthless piece of shit out there is in fact ourselves, is in fact our value, and not simply this other. Okay, thank you very much. This is basically what
Well, thank you, Alenka, for this excellent and inspirative presentation. Before I open the floor for a question and comments, I just want to thank you, our friends who help us to make this meeting possible. Friedrich Ebert Foundation in the first place, Milan Živković is here. I congratulate them for this very firmly support of the project, and also Museum of Contemporary Art for these excellent facilities they offered us. Well, now, сега го отварам делот за кратки коментари, мощни кратки коментари и прашање. Еве, гледам од овде нашата... Само момент. Ја гледам од овде нашата фамозна колешка Катерина Колозова. Дајте го прво, бидете джентлмен, дајте го прво микрофонот неа.
Да, ама ја немам смислено прашање. Здраво, Аленка.
Здраво.
Okay, so this is the first time we see each other in years. I think that the last time we saw each other was in 2003 in Skopje, I believe.
Yeah.
So I was simply remembering a situation over there. It has nothing to do maybe directly with the topic of your lecture. I remembered this moment, this anecdote at that conference, which sort of stuck with me for years. It was some plenary conversation, and Rosie Braidotti, I remember, warned everybody that we were making some kind of an argument, but we had to be cautious not to be perceived as universalists. And then you stood up and protested and you said, but I am a universalist. And I want to defend this position. So I was wondering how you would comment maybe on this, from this perspective. Is this a declaration you would make nowadays, today? And what would that mean in the context of this debate? The migration crisis, the cultural differences, and the ability of appropriation of different cultures into Europe, etc., etc. So these debates as well. How would you address these issues, considering you used to have that position? Is this your position still? And how would you frame this conversation, considering this?
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. No, absolutely, it's still my position, but it has always been, I mean, and this is not only myself, I think there are few of us who try to argue for a certain kind of universalism, which is precisely not this kind of universalism that is mocked by people like Rosie Braidotti or some others who simply see the universalism as such, as a kind of oppressive thing that represses all particularities and or universality as a kind of a general framework within which one then more or less oppressively puts all particularities. There is a certain work that has been done by many other also, by to some extent in a slightly different direction by Alain Badiou. Then of course Slavoj Žižek has all these polemics, discussion with Ernesto Laclau and Judith Butler also on the question of universalism and so on. So for me, universalism, it's not at all something that we should simply give up and say, okay, but now we live in this postmodern society, there is no such thing any longer, we should just embrace particularities and nobody can see the whole picture and so on. No, I really don't think this is the politically right thing to do. I think there is something to say for universalization that comes precisely from a certain particular point of view within these particularities. And this is, for instance, a universalization that, something that, for instance, Lou Althusser knew very well when he was speaking precisely about Marxism and psychoanalysis, and how there are very specific sciences, because there, if you want to be, because there are sciences which are situated within the conflict that they theorize. They are not somewhere above, looking on all these struggles and then deciding who is good or who is bad. They are part of the struggle that they describe. And he says, in this kind of situation, you can only be objective if you occupy a certain point within this struggle, not if you like just try to look at all sides and understand everybody and so on. So, because there are points from which you can see the real conflict, and there are points from which you cannot see it, or they are made so as that you don't see it. And I would relate this, my notion of universal, precisely to something like this. It's not simply everybody is in. Of course there are divides, but there is this kind of universal aim and universal address, which aims at something beyond simply particularities and some kind of a smallest common denominator between them. It's a kind of emancipatory engagement, the process, something that actually engages you in its process, and not simply some kind of abstract form that one puts on entities. So in this sense, I think it's not at all like contradictory on what I was doing here, although I very well see where your question comes from, because the whole question of love and precisely how it differs from this, it should be explained further and so on. But it's not, it does not exclude the question of the universal, I think.
I will misuse my position just to smuggle one question, but short question, is to Alenka. Is political correctness and this changing of our language in that sense a form of love toward neighbor, or just hidden form of this keeping distance and some kind of soft racism?
The second, I think it's not at all the form of the love of the neighbor. I think it's precisely something that I mean, I have lots of problems with many aspects of political correctness. I'm not saying that all is just bad, but there is a certain move in there which is precisely prevented, or which is designed to prevent or even to suppress precisely this problematic point that I was talking about, this point of extremity. Not to deal with it, but a kind of put it outside of even our reach or contemplation, because I think there are many things that come up in our interactions which are resolved on the basis of exchanges which are not completely politically correct, and which kind of are there as a very important territory of making bonds, of making social bonds. And I'm not defending that one should just, I mean, sometimes even insulting each other can be a way in which friends bond. This is not, so I think that the whole political correctness has like, of course, one dimension, which is to refocus completely the whole struggle of the left, which was traditionally related to other questions, more like, also economic questions, to the territory of this kind of more cultural struggles. So if we are on the left, we are for this, and this should replace any other struggle. But more dangerously even, I think that there is this kind of a move which actually prevents us or takes away a certain territory which always needs to be negotiated when we relate to the other. When we want to form any kind of bond with the other, there are risks. We cannot be sure in advance that we won't offend. I mean, you can make, I don't know how many rules, like huge heap of rules, you shouldn't say this and that, but even that, then the slightest hint of hate can function as a kind of, be understood as a kind of insult. But this is precisely what then needs to be negotiated in this space between yourself and the other and worked out. Otherwise, I think it is just, we will just simply stop communicating. It is not, so it's, of course, I very much know this is a more complex question, and it has a certain political reason, which is in value, of course, but as a kind of ultimate response to our social evils. I don't think that this is the best response, and I think it's precisely kind of cuts off this field precisely of enjoyment and the impossibility to say when it is the mine ends and the others begins, which needs to be in some way negotiated and symbolically determined between the people who are in this interaction, and not simply decided for them or made them feel like they can avoid this problem.
Well, thanks. Please, short.
I would completely agree with you, but I would like to ask a methodological question, because classical psychoanalysis on the other side, for example, Jung, takes the example of the Vitruvian man, in which the stomach is above genitalia, and actually in a way this is proven because, for example, the case of Miriam, when she was in the concentration camp, she ate her own baby because she wanted to survive. She didn't cut a part of her body to feed the baby, but she killed her own baby because she was starving. There was a camera in her room. So also regarding this, Margaret Thatcher, I think she was using a humor, because I think from today's point of view she's very labor, because she told us that the society is as successful as the society can buy. She gave us the standards for buying. Потрошувачката кошничка, она е измислила, значи, разбирате што сакам да ви кажам? So, how do you, it is true, for example, Freud in Boy Hans, he gave the example of the boy that when the boy is washing his genitalia with freezing water, he gets an erection because boy thinks that everything is for pleasure. But it is a bourgeois society. I think in today's globalization, Thatcher is considered to be very labor.
Dobro. Има ли друго прашање? Ако не, тогаш да се заблагодарам на гостинката. Има уште? Да.
Hello, hi. My question about your presentation is, you were talking about, correct me if I'm wrong, but you base your entire research and presentation on Christian morality in 21st century geopolitics. And you gave a psychoanalytical analysis of it. But I didn't hear any solutions to it, or I didn't hear your opinion. You were talking about Lacan's interpretation of Freud about the state of the other, of the subject, and I want to hear your opinion about this, especially if I am allowed to be more specific. Should we have Christian morality dictate 21st century politics and law?
Okay, thank you. No, I don't think, I mean, it's precisely what I wanted to say is that the Christian morality is itself has abandoned the Christian ethics as it was kind of exists in this commandment. So I'm not kind of trying to say, okay, let's go back to the commandment. I just tried to point out how precisely this Christian morality that we have around everywhere now is itself already a kind of Aristotelian ethics of the right measure, much more than something that kind of is able even to contemplate a certain radicality involved in this particular commandment, certain impossibility, certain, even if you want, inhuman subversivity. So I think there is something in this commandment that can be, that it's not only a real challenge, but that kind of points the finger precisely on this right problem, which I defined through this concept of extremity, which exists in the social life always and everywhere. And I'm not saying that this Christian morality is particularly not the kind that exists today, is any kind of response to it, and that we should endorse it because it hasn't got a response. The response is simply, okay, but let's forget this. It's not very useful for us today. So solution. I don't have a solution for all the evil, but I think what I wanted to say is basically two things. That there is a certain way in which this commandment already did exist as a social infrastructure in the form of a welfare state. Precisely, that it's like, it would be a kind of Hegelian point, you know, that it is there that it existed at the peak of its notion, so to say. It's not that we should, but this no longer exists, and I really don't think in our present situation that we can go simply back to the welfare state. Why not? Because now the level of precarity is such that people who are or any kind of receive any kind of regular income, be it aid or something else, are already perceived as the elites. I mean, it's the number of people who never had any access to any kind of benefits. It's such that they're actually in a strange pact with the people like very rich rulers like Trump voting for them because they never had access. They see this as a kind of privilege of the middle class. So I think this infrastructure is being dismantled to such an extent that I don't see any easy way to simply say, okay, let's return to the welfare state. I think this is probably, unfortunately, kind of a thing of the past. So something else will have to be invented. And my point was kind of radical, but at the same time very abstract, that this can only happen if we kind of get out of the capitalist form of value as it is, which is kind of, but how to do this, I don't think I have, or anybody has a kind of a ready-made answer to this, but there is a certain, otherwise you just, obviously there are parts of the world which are very poor but are getting a little bit richer. I mean, people, even if they earn like $10 per week, for some this is a huge advance already. So this inequality, till there is this inequality, there will always be somewhere where you could outsource the production. It will be cheap. I mean, this is a kind of, but okay. But if this was your question, so it is, the point is not that I would claim the Christian tradition as the savior here. For me it was just an entry to point out where in this particular commandment, because I wanted to relate this to the question of the law as well, something has been touched which was a kind of neurological point that is still very much of an interest for us today if we want to understand what is happening and why this structure of extremity is still operative, and why this also then happens when we have these crises and stuff, but not as a kind of a horizon of Christian morality. No, this was not the point.
Okay, well, please.
I'm interested in your opinion about multiculturalism and the way it is inscribed in the symbolic order of today's liberal Europe, and about how the multiculturalism addresses this problem of the unattainable estimate of the neighbor, and is this the right fantasy through which we see today's reality, or we need traversing through this fantasy and go to something new?
Thank you. Yeah, I think it's a very good question, precisely because I think very often what is discussed or presented as multiculturalism precisely does not think this point. It kind of simplifies its task by simply saying, okay, there are different cultures, we should all accept each other. I mean, there is this kind of simplistic idea in which there are many differences, but we should be tolerance is another concept that I think it's really lacking in strength when it comes to any serious politics that should change something. Because if you simply tolerate the other, this is already the wording itself is a kind of bizarre, which means, okay, I can tolerate you. So it's obviously that something else is needed, and that precisely this structure needs to be tackled with. And if multiculturalism only means this kind of a empty praise of differences and of peaceful coexistence, which does not comprise or involve or is able to address this kind of conflicts that nevertheless arise, then it's not good enough. Then I think we really need to introduce this structure and complicate the question of multiculturalism. Otherwise, it's only remains only like so many different faces of the same. Because it goes back to this quote from Lacan that, of course, we can love our neighbor or give him whatever as far or be helpful to her if she looks like us. I mean, if they are just like, okay, they're basically, I mean, the moment there is a the slightest real difference that appears, then it's the end of multiculturalism. It kind of has this safety plug in, which means multi is only good as far as this is a kind of very colorful soup, but still is the same soup. But any serious difference then immediately breaks this down and represents its breaking point. So, and this is why I think precisely this concept needs to be introduced and taught.
Yeah, fine. Samo moment. Da li ima drugi? Sorry.
No, I don't think this is even the question of, I'm not claiming that any religion has kind of authority here in the sense of...
Ima li drugi prašanja? Dobro. Ако нема, тогаш ти се заблагодарам на Аленка за прекрасното предавање и на вас што бевте златни и што не почастивте со вашето присуство. Thanks again.
Thank you.